In the year 415 AD, during the solemn Christian season of Lent, a mob tore through the streets of Alexandria. Their target wasn't a criminal or a foreign invader. She was a scholar, a philosopher, in a chariot on her way home. They dragged her from her carriage, hauled her into a church that was once a pagan temple, and there, in a righteous frenzy, they committed an act of unspeakable violence. They stripped her naked and attacked her with what contemporary sources call ostraca, sharpened pieces of pottery or roofing tiles. With these crude weapons, they ended her life. This wasn't a soldier or a politician. This was Hypatia, one of the leading philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers of her time. Her body was then dismembered, paraded through the city, and finally burned to ash. This horrific act of violence against a celebrated intellectual sent shockwaves through the Roman Empire. It has echoed through history for 16 centuries, a grim story of a city at war with itself. How did it come to this? What could drive the citizens of Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the world, to murder one of its brightest stars with such savagery? This is the story of the brutal death of Hypatia and the perfect storm of political ambition, religious fanaticism, and mob violence that sealed her fate. To understand how a philosopher could be so brutally murdered, you have to understand her city. In the early 5th century, Alexandria wasn't just another city in the Roman province of Egypt. It was a crossroads for the entire world. A huge metropolis known for its great library and its history of learning. It was a place where Greek philosophy, Egyptian tradition, and Roman power all collided. But beneath this glittering surface, Alexandria was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The city was a melting pot of cultures and faiths, but it was far from harmonious. Large, often isolated communities of Christians, Jews, and pagans lived in a state of constant, simmering tension. Street brawls and riots were common, often set off by the smallest things. But this wasn't just about street-level animosity, it was a reflection of a much larger power struggle that was transforming the Roman Empire. For centuries, the Greco-Roman gods, the pagan tradition, had been the center of public life. But now, Christianity was on the rise. It had been legalized and was quickly becoming the dominant state religion. This was not a peaceful transition. Across the empire, and especially in Alexandria, this shift was marked by an aggressive, often violent consolidation of power. Just a quarter century before Hypatia's death, the city's Christian patriarch, Theophilus, had ordered the destruction of the magnificent Serapeum, one of the world's most impressive pagan temples. Its statues and art were smashed or melted down, a clear and devastating message to the city's pagans that the old ways were being systematically erased. Into this volatile mix stepped two immensely powerful and ambitious men whose rivalry would light the city's fuse. The first was Orestes, the Roman prefect. As the imperial authority in Egypt, he represented the emperor's law and civil order. He was a Christian, but he was also a politician who valued stability and the rule of Roman law above all else. The second man was Cyril, who became the new patriarch of Alexandria in 412 AD. He inherited the position from his uncle, the same Theophilus who had destroyed the Serapeum, and he was determined to continue that work with even more fire. Cyril wasn't just a spiritual leader. He saw himself as a general in a holy war. Any challenge to his authority wasn't just a political squabble. It was a threat to the church itself. His time as patriarch began with a violent clash against a rival for the position, after which he shut down his opponent's churches and seized their property. He was a man who believed power wasn't something to be shared, but to be taken. At its heart, their conflict was about who really ran the city. Orestes governed in the name of the Roman emperor, but Cyril commanded the loyalty of a massive and increasingly militant Christian population, and he began wielding powers that belonged to the civil government. He was acting as a law unto himself. Orestes couldn't tolerate this. He saw Cyril's actions as a direct threat to his own power and the province's stability. The stage was set for a devastating clash between the two most powerful men in Alexandria. One represented the state, the other, the church. The city had two masters, and it was about to be torn apart by their feud. Caught right in the middle was Hypatia, a woman whose wisdom and influence would make her a target. Long before she became a political symbol, Hypatia was, above all else, a brilliant mind. Born sometime between 355 and 370 AD, she was the daughter of Theon of Alexandria, a respected mathematician and the head of a school within the famous Museum of Alexandria. In an age when most women, even from the elite class, were kept out of public life, Hypatia's father raised her to be his intellectual successor. She studied mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, receiving an education that was extraordinary for anyone, let alone a woman. And Hypatia didn't just learn, she built upon that knowledge, quickly becoming one of the most celebrated scholars of her time. Around the year 400, she became the head of the Platonist school in Alexandria, a remarkable achievement that cemented her status as a leading public intellectual. She was a champion of Neoplatonism, a philosophy that sought a higher, transcendent reality. But her work wasn't purely abstract. It was grounded in rigorous mathematics and science. She wrote commentaries on foundational mathematical texts and was known for constructing scientific instruments like astrolabes for charting the stars and hydrometers for measuring liquid density. But Hypatia was more than a scholar hidden away in a library. She was a charismatic and magnetic public figure. Ancient sources say she would appear in public, wearing the simple cloak of a philosopher, and give impromptu lectures to anyone who would listen. Her formal lectures drew students from all over the Mediterranean. One of her most devoted students was Synesius of Cyrene, a prominent Christian who would later become a bishop. His letters to her are full of reverence, calling her his revered teacher and praising her wisdom. This gets to a crucial part of who Hypatia was, her tolerance. Though a pagan who followed classical philosophical traditions, she was respected by pagans and Christians alike. Her school was open to everyone, and many of her known students were Christians. She managed to navigate Alexandria's treacherous religious landscape by rising above the fray, focusing on the universal pursuit of knowledge and reason. Her dignity and her confidence earned her the respect of everyone she met. As the historian Socrates Scholasticus wrote, she wasn't ashamed to appear before an assembly of men because they admired her all the more for her virtue and authority. It was this very influence that pulled her into the world of power. Her intellect wasn't just for the classroom, it was a resource for the city's leaders. She became a trusted advisor to Alexandria's magistrates, including the Roman prefect Orestes. He deeply admired her and frequently sought her counsel. She became a key figure in his political circle, a symbol of a city governed by reason and civil discourse, not by mob rule or religious dogma. To Orestes, she was a powerful ally. To his rival, Cyril, she was a dangerous obstacle. In a city being carved up by rigid religious identity, Hypatia represented something more fluid and, to some, more threatening. A world where wisdom wasn't owned by a single faith and where a pagan woman could have more sway with the Roman governor than the Christian patriarch himself. Her brilliance made her a star, but in the darkening sky of Alexandria, that light was about to attract the storm. The fight between Cyril and Orestes wasn't subtle. It was a raw, public, and increasingly violent struggle for the soul of Alexandria. As soon as he became patriarch, Cyril moved to consolidate his power. After dealing with a rival Christian sect, he turned his attention to Alexandria's large and ancient Jewish community. Tensions were already high, frequently spilling into violence. The breaking point came when Orestes was publicly announcing a new edict. A man named Hierax, a die-hard follower of Cyril, was in the crowd. The Jewish attendees recognized him and shouted that he was there only to start a riot. Orestes, already suspicious of Cyril's spies, seized the moment to assert his authority. He had Hierax arrested and publicly tortured. For Cyril, the public torture of one of his men was an intolerable insult. He threatened the city's Jewish leaders, who retaliated with a deadly nighttime ambush on the Christian community. In response, Cyril took the law entirely into his own hands. He led a massive crowd to the city's synagogues, drove the Jewish population out of Alexandria, and let his followers plunder their homes and businesses. This was an incredible usurpation of state power. Orestes was furious. A Roman prefect couldn't just stand by while a bishop exiled an entire community from the city. He sent a formal complaint to the emperor. The battle lines were now drawn. The people of Alexandria pushed Cyril to reconcile with the governor, and he made a token effort, approaching Orestes with a Bible as a gesture of peace. Orestes refused, seeing it as a demand that he submit to the church's authority. There would be no peace. The conflict spiraled. A group of about 500 monks from the Nitrian desert, known for their violent zeal, swarmed into Alexandria to act as Cyril's muscle. They cornered Orestes in his chariot, screaming insults and accusing him of being a secret pagan. Orestes insisted he was a baptized Christian, but the monks didn't care. One of them, a monk named Ammonius, threw a stone and hit Orestes in the head, wounding him. The governor's guards fled in terror, and only the city's ordinary people saved him from the mob. Ammonius was captured, and Orestes had him tortured to death. In a move that shocked even many moderate Christians, Cyril retrieved the monk's body, declared him a martyr, and honored him in the church as a saint who had died for the faith. The Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus noted that sensible people knew the monk had simply paid the price for his violent crime. This was the paranoid, violent, and broken city that surrounded Hypatia. As Orestes' friend and trusted advisor, she was tied to him in the public's mind. Among Cyril's supporters, a poisonous rumor began to spread. It was whispered that Hypatia, with her pagan philosophy, was the one keeping Orestes from reconciling with the patriarch. She was painted not just as a political problem, but as a malevolent force. Later, Christian chroniclers like John of Nikiu would amplify this, calling her a sorceress who had beguiled many people through satanic wiles and used magic to turn the governor against the church. This vicious propaganda served a clear purpose. It dehumanized her. It turned the respected philosopher into a wicked witch, a pagan temptress standing in the way of Christian power. Hypatia, the symbol of reason, was now marked for death. She had powerful friends, but she had made a far more powerful enemy. The mob, whipped into a frenzy by Cyril's rhetoric, now had a target. They had a ringleader, a church lector named Peter, and they had their scapegoat. In March of 415 AD, during the holy season of Lent, the plot against Hypatia came to its horrifying end. The most detailed account comes from the church historian Socrates Scholasticus, who wrote just a few decades after the event. He reports that a mob, driven by a fierce and bigoted zeal, ambushed Hypatia as she returned home in her carriage. Their leader was a man named Peter, a lector in the church, a minor official who read scriptures during services. They intercepted her and violently dragged the esteemed philosopher from her carriage. But the mob didn't carry out their sentence on the street. They dragged her to a highly symbolic location, the Caesareum. This grand building had once been a temple dedicated to the worship of Roman emperors. Now it was one of Alexandria's main churches, the very center of Bishop Cyril's power. It was here, inside a Christian church, that the mob would do its unholy work. Inside the Caesareum, they committed the final barbaric act. they stripped Hypatia completely naked, an act of profound humiliation meant to rob her of her famous dignity and authority. Then, the murder began. According to Socrates, they killed her using ostraca. This Greek word can be translated as roofing tiles, oyster shells, or sharpened shards of pottery. Whether they beat her to death or use these jagged instruments to literally flay the flesh from her body is debated, but either way, the act was one of unimaginable brutality. Later sources add even more gruesome details. The philosopher Damascus, writing about a century later, claimed they also gouged out her eyes while she was still alive. While this detail isn't in the earliest account, it speaks to the legend of savagery that quickly formed around her death. The violence didn't end there. Her murder was followed by a ritual desecration. The mob tore her body apart, limb from limb. They then carried her mangled remains to a place called Cinaron and burned them on a pyre, a final act of annihilation meant to erase her from existence, both physically and spiritually. The murder of Hypatia was a crime of breathtaking savagery, made all the more shocking by who she was and the supposed piety of her killers. It was a calculated act of political terror designed to eliminate a key ally of Orestes and send a terrifying message to anyone else who dared to oppose Cyril's authority. While there is no definitive proof that Cyril gave the direct order, the murder was the direct result of the hateful climate he fostered. It was carried out by his supporters under his watch. As Socrates Scholasticus himself wrote, the affair brought not the least opprobrium, not only upon Cyril, but also upon the whole Alexandrian church. He concluded grimly, and surely nothing can be farther from the spirit of Christianity than the allowance of massacres, fights, and transactions of that sort. Hypatia's murder wasn't a minor street crime. It was an event that shocked the Roman Empire. The brutal killing of a high-profile philosopher and advisor demanded a response. An official investigation was launched, but its impact was limited. There are reports that Cyril managed to avoid serious consequences by bribing officials in the emperor's court. Orestes, with his key advisor murdered and his political power shattered, simply disappears from the historical record. Cyril had won. In the immediate aftermath, even Christian writers like Socrates Scholasticus condemned her murder as a profound stain on the Church of Alexandria. But for the city's remaining philosophers, her death was a terrifying turning point. While intellectual life didn't end overnight and paganism continued for centuries, the murder of such a prominent scholar was a devastating blow. Many scholars eventually fled the city, and the school she had led faded. Her death came to symbolize a dark turning point in the clash between the world of classical antiquity and a rising, more dogmatic faith. Over the centuries, Hypatia's story transformed. During the Middle Ages, some scholars believe her story was ironically folded into Christian legend, possibly forming part of the basis for the myth of Saint Catherine of Alexandria. But it was during the Enlightenment that she was truly reborn. Thinkers rediscovered her story and saw a perfect symbol of reason and intellectual freedom crushed by religious fanaticism. She became a feminist icon, a martyr for science, the last of the Hellenes standing defiant against a tide of ignorance. Modern historians urge caution against these more romanticized versions, reminding us that she was killed in a brutal political power struggle, not simply because she was a scientist or a woman. But symbols are powerful. The image of a brilliant woman murdered for the crime of being wise and influential remains a chilling and potent warning. Hypatia's legacy isn't just in the lost fragments of her mathematical works, but in the enduring story of her life and death, a testament to her courage and a timeless reminder of the horrific cost of fanaticism. If you found this dive into one of history's darker chapters compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Let us know in the comments. What other brutal historical events should we uncover next? The story of Hypatia is a tragedy on multiple levels. It's the personal tragedy of a brilliant woman murdered for her influence. It's the political tragedy of a city torn apart by the ambitions of powerful men. And it's the cultural tragedy of an era of classical learning clashing with a new age of militant faith. The light she shone over Alexandria was violently put out, and its loss cast a long shadow that, in many ways, is still with us today.